Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to give you, well, the ultimate shortcut to being really well informed. We dive into those foundational texts, the ones that genuinely shape how we think about the world around us. And today, we're opening a book that, it was written way back, over 170 years ago, but it offers this incredibly clear-eyed analysis of government, stuff that applies, directly to the headlines you probably saw this morning.
Absolutely.
We're launching a deep dive into Frédéric Bastiat's really quite monumental 1850 essay, The Law. Now, this isn't just some dusty old history lesson. You could argue it's maybe the most essential, timeless statement ever written on what government should do, and this eternal fight between organized liberty and, well, organized force.
Yeah, and for anyone trying to get a handle on the philosophical bedrock of justice, liberty, why politics often feels like this destructive battlefield, this essay is basically the definitive map.
It really sets things out clearly.
And we should probably stress the historical context here, because it makes Bastiat's points just incredibly sharp. He was a French economist, a journalist, writing right after the chaos of the 1848 revolution in France.
A lot going on then.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Society was fractured, and these new, pretty seductive socialist theories were popping up. Utopian ideas promising widespread material equality, all achieved through state action. They were gaining huge influence.
Okay.
So Bastiat saw these movements basically trying to grab the reins of the legislative machinery, right?
Yeah.
To use it to force their grand plans onto everybody. He was genuinely alarmed that the law, the very thing meant to protect people, was being systematically twisted, perverted, as he put it, into a tool for seizure and control.
So the essay is a warning, really.
It's an urgent cry, yeah.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack that cry. We need to really get inside Bastiat's core argument.
Yeah.
That the law must be restricted, solely to protecting our natural rights, life, liberty, and property, full stop.
Right.
We'll try to define the boundaries of what makes law legitimate. We'll identify the two major and sometimes kind of opposing reasons it gets perverted, what he famously calls legal plunder. And then, maybe most critically, we need to look at the profound, lasting consequences he predicted. Things like the corruption of morality, politics turning into this relentless zero-sum game, things we can still see.
Yeah, the relevance is pretty startling sometimes.
Okay, so let's start right at the very beginning. Before government even exists on the scene, Bastiat doesn't kick off with political philosophy, does he? He starts with something more basic, with man himself.
Exactly. Anthropology, almost.
He says there are these three gifts, divine or natural, that come before any human laws are written down. What are these cornerstones?
He calls them the sort of constitutive elements of being human. The first one is life itself, our physical existence, our intellectual capacity, our moral being, just being alive.
Simple enough.
Second is faculties. This is basically our capacity to act, our abilities, our talents, or as he often calls it, liberty. It's like an extension of our personality, our right to use our life and our skills as we see fit.
Okay, life and liberty.
And the third one, just as vital, is appropriation, or simply property. He sees this as the natural extension of our faculties. It's the result, the fruit, of using our liberty, of applying our labor.
So if I have the right to use my mind and hands, that's liberty, then it logically follows I have the right to own and control whatever my mind and hands produce. That's property.
Precisely. That link is crucial for him.
So the big insight here, the foundational point, is that these three things, personality, liberty, property, they aren't gifts from the state. They're not granted by law.
No, they are anterior and superior to law. That's his phrase. They don't exist because some king or parliament decreed them. They exist because we are human beings. They're part of the package deal, you might say.
Right. They pre-exist legislation.
Exactly. And this is the logical trap he sees so many political systems fall into. They start acting as if these rights are created by the law. But Bastiat flips it. He insists the law exists because these rights exist and because they need a common defense. If the rights are primary, individual, then the law has to be secondary, derived.
Okay, so if every single person has this inherent right to defend these three things, their person, their freedom, their property, then what the law should be doing becomes pretty straightforward.
It really does. Bastiat's definition of law is, well, it's beautifully minimalist. He says it is simply the collective organization of the individual right to lawful defense.
Collective organization.
Yeah. So if I, as an individual, have the right to use force to stop a thief or someone attacking me, someone threatening my life or property, then a community, a group of individuals can organize a common force, police, courts, maybe a military. And this common force substitutes for that individual isolated force. It makes defense regular, organized. That collective force is the law.
And that act of substitution, that organizing of defense, sets up this absolute non-negotiable boundary for what government force can legitimately do.
Yes, exactly, the boundary condition.
If the law is just a replacement for my individual right to self-defense, then it can't logically do anything that I couldn't legally do myself, right?
That's the absolute core of Bastiat's argument. If I, acting alone, cannot lawfully say, destroy your person or take away your liberty or just plain steal your property, then the collective force, the law, embodied by the state, cannot lawfully do those things either.
It seems obvious when you put it like that.
It does, but think about how often it's violated. If the state uses its collective force for anything other than defense, maybe redistributing wealth, organizing specific industries, imposing religious beliefs, whatever he argues is using a collective power for destruction and plunder, it actually violates the very principle it was supposedly created to uphold. It becomes an internal contradiction.
Okay, so let's imagine this ideal state. If we actually manage to keep the law strictly within this defensive sphere, just organizing justice, ensuring safety, what does society look like in practical terms, according to Bastiat?
He paints a picture of a society with profound stability. Because the law is predictable, it's just. Citizens would feel, he says, the full responsibility of their existence, meaning they'd know their success or failure rests largely on their own abilities, their own choices, their own hard work, not on who they know in government or how well they can lobby a committee. If a farmer has a bad harvest because of, hail or frost, as he puts it, he wouldn't automatically blame some government agency. He'd just recognize it as one of the inherent challenges of life and farming.
The government sort of recedes into the background. It becomes, as he says, known mainly by the inestimable blessing of safety. It's like an invisible but totally trustworthy fence protecting our rights.
Exactly. It's there, it's reliable, but it's not constantly interfering. And the economic outcome he envisions is huge. When the state doesn't meddle in private affairs, telling people what to produce, who to trade with, what prices to set, then wants and satisfaction, supply and demand, they just develop naturally.
Organically,
yeah. Capital, labor, population. They'd flow towards the most productive, most efficient uses without being artificially pushed and pulled by legislation. We wouldn't see these great displacements of capital, of labor, and of population caused by political decisions. Think about, say, huge industry shifts when tariffs are suddenly imposed or removed, or massive tax changes that reshape entire sectors. Bastiat saw those legislative actions as introducing volatility, making people's livelihoods precarious, where a natural economic order would tend towards stability.
So it sounds like he's arguing for a government so limited, its success is almost measured by how little friction it creates, how little you notice it in your daily life, unless your rights are violated.
Precisely. It just secures the playing field, makes sure the rules are fair, meaning nobody's cheating or using force, and then it steps back. It allows human energy, creativity, individual initiative to flourish without constant official meddling.
Okay, that's the ideal. Beautiful, stable, predictable, but tragically, as Bastiat points out, it's also incredibly fragile. So now we have to turn to part 2, where the analysis gets, darker. We look at the pathology, the ways this ideal gets twisted. He argues that the very moment the law steps outside that strictly defensive boundary, it stops establishing justice and actually starts destroying it.
Right. This is the great inversion he warns about. The law essentially turns plunder, taking what isn't yours, into a right, something protected by the collective force of the state. And at the same time, it makes lawful defense against that state-sanctioned plunder a crime, something to be punished.
Can you give an example?
Well, imagine someone trying to physically defend their property from, say, a tax collector who's enforcing a law that Bastiat would see as unjust plunder, maybe a wildly discriminatory tax. In that scenario, the law flips the moral calculus completely. The person defending their own property becomes the criminal, and the agent taking it becomes the enforcer of right.
That's a powerful inversion. Before we dig deeper into how this happens, we need that specific definition of plunder. Bastiat was very precise about this term, wasn't he?
extremely precise. He wanted a scientific definition. Plunder, he says, occurs whenever a portion of wealth passes out of the hands of the person who created it or earned it without their consent and without compensation and into the hands of someone who did not create it.
Okay, transfer without consent or compensation.
Crucially, this transfer has to be achieved by either force or artifice. Brute strength or clever deception, basically. Now, when this act of plunder is sanctioned by the law, when the state uses its organized collective force to make the transfer happen, that is what he terms legal plunder.
Got it. So it's theft, but wearing the uniform of the state.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And Bastiat identifies two distinct routes, two main motivations behind this perversion of law. This is what makes his analysis so relevant across time, I think. The first one is pretty straightforward, almost primal.
What?
The first route is just naked greed. Simple as that. He calls it man's fatal disposition to want to live and develop at the expense of others. History is absolutely full of it, right? War, slavery, fraud, monopoly.
Sure.
Bastiat observes, quite pragmatically, that whenever plunder seems less burdensome, less difficult, or less dangerous than honest labor, well, plunder tends to prevail. People take the easier path if they can get away with it.
Okay, but how does that relate to legal plunder?
The problem explodes when this basic human instinct gets legislative cover. Historically, he notes, law was often made by one person, a king, or one specific class, the aristocracy. Naturally, they tended to place the power of lawmaking in their own hands and, surprise, surprise, used it for their own profit. They used the law to destroy the liberty or seize the property of the masses. This is the origin of what he calls partial plunder.
So one group using the law to exploit others.
Right. But Bastiat saw a critical danger emerging in his own time, especially with the rise of democracy and broader suffrage. Once the previously plundered classes finally gained political rights, universal suffrage being the main tool, their first impulse, he feared, is often not to abolish plunder altogether.
What is it then?
Instead, it's to organize against the other classes a system of reprisals. They want to turn the tables.
Ah, so the victims want their turn at being the perpetrators. They want to use the law to get back what was taken or just to get their share now.
Exactly. And this transforms partial plunder into a furious, chaotic competition for what he calls universal plunder.
Universal plunder, like everyone trying to plunder everyone else through legislation.
Precisely. The government itself becomes the grand prize in a political war because controlling the legislature means controlling the power to tax and spend, to regulate and subsidize. It means deciding who pays and who receives the benefits of legal plunder. That's the cynical, greedy side of the pathology.
Okay, that's one route. Naked greed, using the law as a weapon. But you said there were two. What's the second?
The second route is much more insidious, partly because it often comes wrapped in the language of virtue, of caring. He calls it misconceived philanthropy.
Misconceived philanthropy. How does that work?
This is the idea really central to the socialist movements of his day and arguably very influential in modern progressivism too, that the law must be philanthropic, that it's not enough for the law just to be just, it has to be kind. That the collective force of the state has a positive duty to actively use compulsion force to spread material well-being, to provide instruction, to enforce morality directly across the entire nation.
Now, wait a minute. Many people today, maybe most people, would hear that and say, well, yeah, isn't that what a decent, caring society does? Isn't state-funded education or a social safety net a moral good? How does Bastiat square the moral desirability of helping people with his strict view of legal justice?
He tackles this head on. He argues that the very moment you employ the law, which is fundamentally force for these philanthropic goals, you introduce a fatal contradiction. Law is compulsion. To organize labor or instruction or charity by force inevitably requires substituting the legislator's will for the individual's will. It means taking resources from one person against their will to give to another, or dictating how someone must live or work.
So it violates their liberty and property, even if the intention is good.
Exactly. In his view, you cannot transfer wealth or compel action, even for the noblest sounding cause, without initiating an injustice against the person whose liberty or property is violated. True fraternity, true charity, he insists, must be voluntary. It comes from the heart, from free association. When you enforce kindness through law, it ceases to be kindness and becomes, in his framework, simply plunder or coercion.
That's a tough line.
It is, but he was adamant. He recognized that this push for forced philanthropy was the fascinating side of socialism. It appeals powerfully to our better angels, our desire to help others. But, he warned, it tragically insists on using the worst possible means, legal coercion, state force, to achieve those arguably good ends.
You mentioned he gave specific examples of policies he saw as legal plunder back in 1850. Let's make this more concrete. What kind of things did he point to as fundamentally unjust, regardless of whatever benefits they supposedly offered?
Right, he wasn't just theoretical, he pointed fingers. He condemned any policy that systematically enriched one group at the direct expense of another through the mechanism of law. High on his list were protectionist tariffs.
Why tariffs?
Because a tariff is essentially a forced tax on all consumers of a product designed to artificially inflate the price. This benefits the less efficient domestic producers of that product by shielding them from competition, but it harms everyone else who has to pay more. It's a transfer of wealth, by law, from the consumer to the protected industry.
Okay. What else?
Government subsidies of all kinds taking tax money from everyone to prop up a favored business or group. Progressive taxation, he saw this as fundamentally unjust, because it takes unequally from those who produced more, violating the principle of equal treatment under the law, which should only protect property, not redistribute it based on amount.
That's controversial even today.
Oh, absolutely. He also condemned usury laws, attempts to control the price of credit, interfering with voluntary contracts, and even forced public education if it meant taxing everyone, including those who might prefer different educational choices or couldn't afford the tax, to fund a state-run system.
Wow. So if today the government taxes the general population to give subsidies to, say, a solar panel company or maybe a domestic steel manufacturer, Bastiat would look at that transfer and say,
he'd say, that specific legislative act is legal plunder. It benefits the manufacturer, not through voluntary exchange in the market, but by political artifice, by force of law. The consumer, or the general taxpayer, is forced to pay more or contribute tax money for a service or product they didn't necessarily choose, solely to benefit a politically favored group.
Even if the stated goal is noble, like creating jobs or protecting national security.
For Bastiat, the mechanism is the key. If the mechanism involves violating property rights through legal force taking from A without consent to give to B, then it's plunder, regardless of the stated intention. The road to injustice, for him, could be paved with good intentions, backed by state power.
And this all leads him to this powerful conclusion about what he called the delusion of the day. What's the big modern error he identifies?
It's the attempt to enrich all classes at the expense of each other. Think about it like a vast, complicated legislative shell game. Everyone is promised some benefit protection for this industry, subsidies for that group, special programs for another, but the costs are diffused, hidden in complex laws, taxes, and regulations. This makes the plunder systematic and universal.
Everyone's got their hand in someone else's pocket, legally.
That's a blunt way to put it, but yes. This generalization of injustice, organized and sanctioned by the law itself, is exactly what Bastiat identified as the essence of socialism in his time. It turns society into this giant mechanism of taking and receiving, all blessed and protected by the very institution, the law, that was originally meant to prevent such things.
Okay, so when the law crosses that line, when it goes from just defending rights to actively organizing plunder, the consequences ripple out far beyond just economics, don't they? Bastiat argued it strikes right at the moral core, the soul of society.
Absolutely. He thought the most striking effect, and probably the most dangerous one in the long run, is the complete corruption of conscience. It's like the moral compass of the entire nation starts to spin wildly.
How does that happen? The effacement of the line between justice and injustice.
Yes, that effacement is truly corrosive. Think about it. When the law commands one thing, say, forced redistribution of wealth, taking from producers to give to non-producers, the basic morality, the intuitive sense of justice, commands another, like the right to keep what you've honestly earned. The average citizen gets stuck in a terrible bind.
A dilemma.
A cruel dilemma, he called it. They face a choice. Either they lose their own moral sense by accepting the legality of the plunder, convincing themselves it must be okay because the law says so, or they lose their respect for the law itself, seeing it as unjust and predatory. You can't really have a stable, healthy society if citizens are constantly forced to choose between being moral and being law-abiding.
And he pointed out something fascinating about human psychology here, that we have this strong tendency to see whatever is lawful as automatically legitimate. If the state sanctions plunder through law, most people, maybe even the victims of that plunder, will eventually just accept it. They'll conclude it must be just, maybe even sacred, simply because it's the law.
That is the deep tragedy he observed. He saw it happening all around him. With slavery, for instance, which was perfectly lawful in many places. He saw it with protective tariffs, with state-granted monopolies. People who were clearly harmed, oppressed by these systems, would still find ways to defend them. Why? Because they couldn't easily conceive of a moral standard independent of what the state commanded. The state effectively becomes the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong.
And he gave a really chilling specific example of how this corruption gets actively enforced, didn't he? Something about education.
Yes, it's a perfect illustration of how a state engaged in legal plunder needs to control the narrative to keep the system going. Bastiat reported that official bodies in France were actually demanding that professors, people teaching political economy or moral philosophy, teach their subjects only with reference to existing laws and regulations.
Seriously, they couldn't critique existing laws.
They were explicitly instructed to avoid saying anything that might endanger the respect due to the laws now in force. Think about what that means. If the current laws sanctioned obvious forms of plunder like slavery, or high tariffs that benefited connected industries, the professors were essentially being required by the state to teach that these injustices were morally correct, or at least acceptable, simply because they were legal.
Wow. So the state tries to outlaw the very critical thinking that might expose its own injustice.
Precisely. It's an intellectual crackdown, a clear sign that the law has become predatory and needs to protect itself from moral scrutiny. And this directly feeds into the next major consequence Bastiat identified, the exaggerated importance of politics.
Right. How does legal plunder make politics so all-consuming?
Well, think about it. If the law is confined strictly to its proper defensive role, protecting everyone's life, liberty, property equally, then politics becomes largely technical. It's about administering justice efficiently, running the police and courts fairly. It's important, but it's not usually a source of constant bitter conflict. But the moment the law becomes the great dispenser of favors, the tool for distributing wealth, power, and special privileges, the moment it becomes an instrument for taking the law, then the whole political sphere transforms. It becomes this high-stakes, all-consuming struggle. The stakes feel existential. Why? Because you must control the legislature, or you risk being plundered yourself.
It becomes a fight for survival, almost.
In a way, yes. The competition to gain control of the lawmaking apparatus, and then, as we discussed, to institute those systems of reprisals against other groups, is what causes the constant, furious conflict that Bastiat saw raging around the legislative palace. Every election, every political debate becomes this intense, almost life-or-death struggle, because the difference between winning and losing politically translates directly into the difference between receiving a subsidy and paying the tax for it, between getting legal protection for your industry and being exposed to competition funded by others' property.
And this intense struggle really crystallizes in the debate over who gets to participate in this process, right? The fight over suffrage, who gets to vote.
Exactly. He calls it the suffrage sophism. If the law were truly limited to just organizing defense, protecting everyone equally, then the debate over who gets to vote, while still important, would lose a lot of its heat. The government wouldn't have that much power to distribute favors or inflict harm based on group identity.
But it does have that power under legal plunder.
But once the law becomes the primary mechanism for redistribution, for plunder, then every group that's excluded from voting realizes something crucial. They're missing out on access to the main tool of enrichment and self-defense in this perverted system. They need the vote not just for abstract rights, but to get their share of the spoils, or at least to stop others from plundering them so easily.
And Bastiat gives that really memorable, almost darkly funny example of this logic in action, the beggars and vagabonds.
Yes, it's completely logical within the twisted framework of legal plunder. They basically stand up and argue.
What do they say?
They say, essentially, hey, since everybody else is trafficking in the law for their own profit, making laws to benefit themselves, well, we'd like to do the same thing. We demand the vote so we can make the law produce the right to assistance. And they're quite blunt about it, calling this right the poor man's plunder.
So they see the richer classes getting tariffs and subsidies through law,
which they correctly identify as the plunder of the rich.
And they say, okay, fair enough. We just want our own form of legal privilege, a state-guaranteed minimum existence funded by taxing others. It's just plunder for a different class.
And Bastiat's devastating point is, if you accept the legitimacy of the protectionist tariff to the manufacturer's plunder, then you have absolutely no logical ground to stand on to deny the beggar his right to assistance, the poor man's plunder. Once you abandon the core principle that the law exists only to secure property, not to violate it, then all claims for special legal privilege, whether they come from the rich or the poor, become logically equivalent.
Wow. The only difference is maybe the scale or the target.
Right. And this explains why political conflict becomes so bitter and intractable. As long as the law is allowed to violate property instead of just securing it, the central political question will always be, as Bastiat put it, prejudicial, predominant, and absorbing. It overshadows everything else in social life.
He even saw this dynamic threatening the United States, didn't he? A place he generally admired back in 1850.
Yes, he saw America as being remarkably close to his ideal of limited government, compared to Europe at least. And yet he pointed out that the only two issues that seriously endangered the political order of the Union at that time were slavery and tariffs.
The two exceptions.
Exactly. And notice what they are. Slavery was the ultimate horrific violation of the person, a total perversion of law to plunder life and liberty itself. Tariffs were the prime example of the perversion of law to plunder property for the benefit of specific industries. Bastiat understood presciently that these two specific instances where American law had taken on the character of a plunderer violating personhood and violating property created moral and political contradictions so deep they could literally tear the country apart because they fundamentally contradicted the nation's founding promise of protecting natural rights.
That's a really stark warning. The law is either the shield, protecting everyone's rights equally, or it becomes the sword, used by some groups to attack the rights of others. And there's really no stable middle ground where it can be both.
That seems to be precisely his conclusion. Any attempt to make the law do good by violating rights inevitably turns it into an instrument of injustice. And this whole system, this perversion of law into plunder, it doesn't just happen by accident. It's founded on a very specific psychological flaw, a kind of intellectual arrogance that Bastiat saw as common among those who crave political power. He calls it the presumptuous notion, or maybe we could call it the statist mentality.
Okay.
This is the critique Bastiat levels squarely at the modern politicians of his day, especially the socialists, but really anyone who believes society can't function properly unless it receives its main impulse, its direction, from governmental power. The organizers, he calls them.
And this belief, it requires them to have a really strange, divided view of human nature, doesn't it? They have to split mankind into two fundamentally different categories.
That's exactly right. On the one hand, they see the vast majority of people, the masses, the general population, as basically inert. Like inert matter, passive particles, atoms without impulse, are some of his phrases. They see the populace as sheep, fundamentally incapable of acting morally, economically, or intellectually in their own best interests without constant supervision and direction from above.
Passive clay waiting to be molded.
Yes. And then on the other hand, they see themselves, the politician, the legislator, the organizer, the founder, as being made of fundamentally different, superior stuff. They possess the active will, the creative hand, the unique intelligence required to properly shape society, to impose order on the passive masses.
The analogy they implicitly use is incredibly condescending, isn't it? Treating people like
a gardener treats trees, forcing them into unnatural shapes, pyramids, parasols, cubes, whatever the gardener fancies, or like a chemist manipulating inert substances in a laboratory. You, the listener, me, everyone else, we're just the raw material waiting for the wise politician to mold us into their preferred socially acceptable form.
And Bastiat just skewers this with a simple, devastating question. Why? Why do these organizers believe they are made of finer clay? What makes them think they're exempt from the supposed flaws and incompetence they attribute to everyone else?
It's the ultimate intellectual hubris, isn't it? They seem to view the natural human desire for liberty, to make one's own choices, run one's own life, not as a virtue, but almost as a kind of disease that needs to be cured by government controls and interventions.
And Bastiat finds the roots of this strange idea running deep in the European intellectual tradition, especially in the way classical history was taught in the elite schools of his time. They basically taught reverence for ancient figures who supposedly molded entire populations like clay.
Oh yeah, look at the examples they held up. Like Kyrgyz and Sparta, who supposedly mixed theft and even infanticide with justice to create his desired social order, or Minos in Crete, whose laws were credited by writers like Fenelon as being the sole source of all Cretan virtue and prosperity, implying the Cretans themselves were just passive recipients of the king's genius.
So the people are nothing without the great lawgiver.
That's the message. Bastiat quotes Bishop Bossuet admiring the Egyptians because their laws supposedly assigned every single person their specific employment from birth. No room for individual choice there. Even major Enlightenment thinkers, people we might respect, weren't immune. Montesquieu suggested laws should dispose of all fortunes and actively work to equalize inequality by burdens on the rich.
Which sounds exactly like
a direct call for the kind of legal plunder Bastiat was fighting against, all organized from the top down by the supposedly wise legislator. This pervasive belief among the educated elite was that only the lawgiver truly possessed the blueprint for a good society, and the people, for their own good, must be forced to conform and receive the benefits.
And who was the most important influence for the democratic socialists of his era?
Rousseau, absolutely. Bastiat calls him the paramount authority of the Democrats. And Rousseau, quite explicitly, admitted the entire passiveness of human nature in the face of the legislator.
How did Rousseau put it?
He basically said the lawgiver is like the engineer who invents the machine, mankind. Mankind is just the raw material, the stuff the machine is built from. Rousseau was incredibly demanding about the power this lawgiver needed. He said the lawgiver must have the power to transform every individual, to essentially destroy their natural physical independence and substitute a purely social, state-determined existence in its place.
That sounds chillingly like totalitarianism, a complete reshaping of human nature by state decree.
It's an explicit call for total social engineering, yeah. And it absolutely requires crushing individual autonomy, which then sets up this grand, almost comical contradiction of democracy that Bastiat just exposes so ruthlessly.
What's the contradiction?
Well, think about it. The socialists and radical Democrats of his time displayed this almost mystical, unlimited faith in the wisdom and capability of the common man. But only when it came to electing the legislator. They championed universal suffrage, trusting every single person, no matter how uneducated or poor, to wisely choose the leader who would then design and run the entire society.
Okay, so unlimited faith in the voter.
But then, the very instant that supposedly wise legislator is elected, all that faith in the common person vanishes completely. Suddenly, the organizers assume that the very same people who just wisely elected them are now utterly incompetent, constantly being drawn downwards towards degradation, misery, and error.
So the people are wise enough to choose their master, but too stupid to live freely without him.
That's basically it. They argue that ordinary people simply cannot handle basic liberty. If you leave conscience free, they'll fall into atheism. If you leave education free, parents will stupidly pay professors to teach their kids only immorality and error. If you leave labor and exchange free, it will just lead to ruinous competition and the extermination of the workers.
It's a very dim view of humanity, except for the political class.
It implies that free individuals, left to their own devices, will inevitably just plunge themselves and society into atheism, isolation, ignorance, misery, and greed, unless they are constantly guided, restrained, shaped, and directed by the benevolent hand of the elected organizer wielding the power of the law.
And the unavoidable conclusion of this whole mindset, this reliance on legal force for everything, it implies something about the organizer too, doesn't it?
Yes, it rests on the implied infallibility of the organizer. The legislator must be virtually godlike in wisdom and virtue to manage all this complexity correctly. And, simultaneously, it assumes the total incompetence of the masses being organized. This attitude has huge practical consequences, because the law, under this philosophy, has volunteered to take responsibility for positive outcomes, for creating wealth, ensuring morality, providing education, guaranteeing jobs.
If any of those things fail, who gets the blame?
The government. Instantly. If industry slumps, if wages are low, if education results disappoint, if people are unhappy, the immediate cry is, the government must fix it. The law isn't working. This ensures constant political agitation, perpetual blame shifting, and the endless threat of instability, even revolution. Because the law has rashly taken responsibility for every individual's well-being and grievance, it must logically answer for every single failure or disappointment. This, Bastiat says, is why politics never rests, why it's always in turmoil in societies that embrace legal plunder and the organizer mentality.
Okay, so after this really quite devastating dissection of how law gets perverted and the arrogant mindset behind it, Bastiat brings us back. He offers a solution, and it's powerful because it's fundamentally simple.
It is. The only remedy, he insists, is to drag the law back, kicking and screaming if necessary, to confine it strictly to its sole proper domain, organizing justice. Nothing more.
He's absolutely crystal clear on this, isn't he? Law is not supposed to be religious. It's not supposed to enforce fraternity. It's not meant to direct industry. It's definitely not meant to equalize outcomes. Any attempt to use the force of law for those kinds of positive, constructive functions inevitably ends up destroying its essential negative function, which is just securing individual defense, protecting rights from violation.
Exactly. And the reason justice is the only legitimate domain for law is because, unlike those other goals, justice is an immutable quantity. It means it's simple, it's definable, it's bounded. Justice primarily requires just abstaining from harming others. Don't violate their person, don't steal their property, don't restrict their liberty unjustly.
It's like drawing a clear line.
Think of it like drawing a clear property boundary.
Yeah.
A fence line that everyone understands and respects. That fence, representing justice, is stable, it's movable, and crucially, it's not oppressive because it applies equally to everyone. It just says, don't cross this line.
Okay. Justice is clear and bounded. What about the alternatives, like legislated fraternity or philanthropy?
That's the problem. Fraternity, philanthropy, equality of outcomes. When you try to legislate these things, they lack fixed limits. They become vague, open-ended commitments. Where does mandatory state charity stop? How much equality is enough? One political organizer demands legal protection for domestic industry. Another demands state-guaranteed housing for all. A third wants free arts programs funded by taxes. A fourth insists on a universal basic income.
It becomes an endless wish list.
It does. And this inherent vagueness leads directly to uncertainty, constant debate, and what Bastiat calls a multitude of contending utopias. The legislature inevitably becomes a political battlefield where every faction fights tooth and nail to impose its own subjective definition of good or fair or kind on everyone else using the force of law.
So it sounds like justice, properly understood, creates certainty and peace, while legislated philanthropy, however well-intentioned, creates conflict and infinite demands on the public purse.
That's a great way to put it. If the law is simply administering justice, defining and defending rights, Bastiat notes, nobody really revolts against the Supreme Court just doing its job interpreting contracts or property disputes fairly. But if the law gets into the business of administering mandatory kindness or enforcing economic equality, then everyone eventually revolts, because the definition of kindness or equality is always subjective, always changing, and always involves taking someone else's liberty or property to achieve it.
Which leads us to Bastiat's ultimate rallying cry, his final positive vision.
Yes, liberty is the act of faith. After all the critique, he concludes that the only real, sustainable solution to the social problem is found in one word: liberty. And for him, embracing liberty isn't just a political calculation, it's profound. It's an act of faith in God and in his work.
What does he mean by that? Faith?
It means trusting that the Creator, or nature, if you prefer, has already implanted in mankind, in each individual, everything necessary to accomplish our destiny. That we have faculties, intelligence, foresight, and that our natural social organs, things like family, markets, voluntary associations, churches, communities, are inherently constituted to develop harmoniously, to solve problems, to create prosperity, if only they are allowed to operate in the grand air of liberty, free from coercive interference.
So it's a deep confidence in human potential once freed from state control.
Yes, a confidence in individual initiative, in free association, in voluntary exchange, in people figuring things out for themselves. It's the polar opposite of the organizer's mentality. It means trusting that ordinary men and women are not the inert matter the politicians claim they are, but are actually capable, self-directed beings, perfectly able to manage their own lives and cooperate peacefully when their rights are secure.
Does he offer any evidence for this optimistic faith in liberty?
He does, by pointing to the real world as he saw it. He basically asks, look around, where do we find the happiest nations?
And the answer is...
He observed that the happiest, the most moral, and the most peaceful nations are consistently those where the law interferes the least with private activity, where individuality has the most scope, as he put it, where the machinery of government administration is the least complicated, the least burdensome, the least felt in daily life. In these societies, he argued, nothing significant is attempted by collective force except the organization of universal justice, simply enforcing the rules fairly for everyone, not trying to design all the outcomes. They trust the human engine. They just work to secure the chassis. #outro.
And that brings us towards the end of this really quite profound deep dive into Bastiat's The Law. He finishes this magnificent, concise essay with a really compelling parable, an image that just forces us to question that whole paternalistic, controlling mindset of the political organizer. He tells the story of a celebrated traveler visiting what he calls a savage tribe. And there are these quacks, these self-proclaimed organizers surrounding a newborn baby. They're armed with, like, rings and hooks and bandages.
Tools of improvement.
Right. And they want to start perfecting the child immediately. Stretch its nostrils this way, draw out its ears that way, maybe bend its legs to make them straighter, all to make the child conform to their preconceived ideals of what a perfect human should look like.
It's the organizer mentality applied literally to the human body.
Exactly. And the traveler, horrified, commands them to stop. He says, "Stop. Whatever God does is well done. Do not pretend to know more than he. And as he has given organs to this frail creature, allow those organs to develop themselves by exercise, use, experience, and liberty."
Wow. That analogy just cuts right through, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's timeless. And it leaves us today with a clear mandate, I think. We have to continually try to identify the modern rings, hooks, and bandages of legal plunder in our own society.
What are they today?
Well, the coercive regulations that stifle innovation, the systematic subsidies that distort markets and reward political connections, the mandates that override individual choice in healthcare or education, all the ways the law is used not just to protect, but to shape and control us according to some planner's design.
And we have to question the motives behind them.
We have to ask, how much do we really trust what Bastiat called the providential social physiology, the natural capacity of human beings and voluntary institutions to grow, adapt, and thrive in freedom? How much do we trust that versus how much faith do we place in the endless, often contradictory, and frequently destructive systems imposed on us by the political organizers?
So the ultimate question Bastiat forces us, even now, to keep asking about every single piece of legislation, every government program, whether it's about tariffs or education or healthcare or charity, it's brutally simple, isn't it?
It is. Is this law organizing justice, simply protecting rights equally? Or is it legalizing plunder, using force to benefit one group at the expense of another?
And his final warning echoes down to us. If we ask the law to be anything more than simple justice, we run the very real risk Bastiat promises of making it nothing less than universal injustice.
That's a concept definitely worth mulling over.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.